Hi, I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, a veterinary behaviorist who is the Director of Community Solutions at Maddie's Fund.
Hi, I'm Kelly Dewar. I am the Senior Community Solutions Specialist, and I specialize in mostly foster care.
Thanks, Kelly. Welcome to our education research series. Maddie's Insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people, and tips that you can use in your own shelter. Today, I'm excited that we are joined by Dr. Monique Udell, an associate professor of animal sciences at Oregon State University, where she also runs the Human Animal Interactions Lab. She is also the co-director of an animal assisted intervention program dedicated to improving the quality of life of children with and without developmental disabilities and their pets. Today, she will give us an overview of attachment theory and how this knowledge can be applied to better understand and improve dog-human relationships. Welcome, Dr. Udell.
Hi, thank you for having me. And thank you all for being here to learn about attachment and the relationships that we share with our dog companions. We're going to really focus on the bonds from the dog's perspective today, in the human or the dog-human bonding. And what we're hopefully going to be able to cover today, like I said before, is what is attachment, how do we study it, how we evaluate it, both the quality and kind, and then what we can do to try to improve those mutual relationships, and then the welfare of both the dog and the human through these improved bonds. So first, I think it's important to think about what we mean by attachment. And attachment actually comes from the ethological sciences, ethology, where it means basically any sort of affectional tie between two individuals that at its very root creates a desire to seek proximity and also some level of contact exploration balance. So from the ethological perspective, these are relationships that initially form with parents and offspring of non-human animals or humans that allows animals, young animals, to learn how to explore their environment, to learn the things that they need to learn to survive and thrive in that environment, while still having that security of an attachment figure nearby that can provide resources and protection and guidance. There are a few hallmarks of attachment relationships, especially when we're talking about caregiver-dependent relationships. We tend to see not only that proximity-seeking behavior when an attachment figure is nearby, but we also see some level of separation distress when that attachment figure is absent. So this is what promotes, again, that proximity seeking when the attachment figure or that caregiver is gone. It's why young animals often cry out for their mother to return if they leave the den or if they leave the nest. And so we see that same sort of separation distress sometimes in our own homes. This is not separation anxiety. It's not a clinical diagnosis, and it's not sort of extreme version of the behavior. But most dogs and most cats, if their owner leaves the house, will look for them, will maybe whine or vocalize a bit before they settle down. So that's what we mean by separation distress. And then we also look for things like reunion behavior. How does the animal respond or the child respond when that caregiver returns? Do they go up, they greet, are they happy and enthusiastic to see that person or that, attachment figure? And in secure attachment relationships, do we see what we call contact exploration balance, which is not only do these individuals seek the proximity of the attachment figure, but then they can also use that attachment figure as a secure base from which to explore the environment and learn how to be independent and on their own. Now, if we look at the history of attachment-related research, really it starts as early as the 1950s. And attachment research, because at its root is an ethological concept, it actually started with research in non-human animals. Some of the first research of attachment was done by Harry Harlow in the early 1950s, looking at relationships and bonds formed between young infant non-human primates and either mothers or other types of attachment figures. So if you've heard at all of the cloth or wire mother studies, those were part of a bigger research agenda focused on attachment relationships. From there, other scientists like Konrad Lorenz and other ethologists were interested in attachment relationships in other species, not only in lab settings, but also in naturalistic settings, and also cross-species attachment relationships. So if you've ever seen some of those famous images of goslings or ducklings following Konrad Lorenz as he walks across a field, that was all imprinting and attachment research as well. And then soon after, in around the late 1950s, early 1960s, we start seeing this attachment research entering the human research realm as well. John Bowlby and others took these approaches from ethology and applied them to human psychology. And so in the 1960s and 1970s, Bowlby and his student Mary Ainsworth converted these tests that had traditionally been done with non-human species into what became the strange situation test, which is sort of a test that's famously known to test attachment styles in human infants and toddlers to their primary caregivers, often their mothers. Since then, there's been about 50 plus years of really intensive research into this human attachment realm. And so we have a lot of research in psychology on human attachment relationships and all the nuances and what they predict and what they mean. So much so that oftentimes now when we talk about attachment research, people think about the human side of this. They think about the human research, and they don't always realize that there's also the animal side that has this equally long history, or even longer in some cases. So this is important because right off the bat, it's important to know that attachment is not a species-specific characteristic or trait. So attachment is found in a wide range of species that require any sort of care and provisioning after birth, and different types of attachment are found in a wide variety of social species across mammals, birds, even some reptiles. So it's pretty broad in terms of the number of species that exhibit attachment-related behaviors. It's also important to know that just like Konrad Lorenz studied and others, that attachment can occur across species. So it's not one of those traits or behaviors that we only see occurring within one specific species. And in fact, in practice, we've known to some extent that dogs could attach across species way longer than we've had research on this topic. So fundamentally, if we think about animals like livestock guardian dogs, the big white fluffy dogs that stand out with the sheep and protect them from potential predators, livestock guardian dogs have been bonded to sheep and used in that capacity for at least 6,000 years. So even though we didn't have the research on it, people recognized that there was this ability for this cross-species bonding to occur many thousands of years ago. So there's sort of a long history here. So why are these early origins important to what I'm going to tell you today? First, I think it's important to note that when we talk about attachment or cross-species attachment, we don't have to worry about it being anthropomorphic, because fundamentally attachment is not a human trait. It's a cross-species trait. It also sort of points out that the theoretical framework for studying attachment includes but extends beyond the Ainsworth strain situation test. So oftentimes we think of attachment as being linked to this one methodological approach, but there's actually many different types of tests that you can use to evaluate attachment in different settings and depending on the type and kind of attachment you're interested in. So this can help us get at the root of understanding it better, but also expands the range of assessments that we could potentially use if evaluating attachment in an applied or a research setting is important to us. The final thing I want to point out is that we shouldn't just stop at, do animals have it? Are dogs attached to people? Are cats attached to people? Are people attached to dogs? Because that's only one part of the question. We have a lot of evidence that these attachments can occur, but we also know that not all attachments are the same. There are individual differences in attachment relationships that are formed within the same species or between two different species. The first way that they can differ is they can vary by kind. So if we just look at human attachment, we can see that there are attachment styles or attachment relationships that can be studied between parents and offspring. There are attachment relationships that occur between romantic partners. There are attachment relationships that occur between siblings. There are relationships that occur between friends, between bosses and employees. And so while all of these might represent different types of relationships that can tie into areas of attachment, the kind of relationship formed in each of these settings is very distinct and wouldn't expect to see the same behaviors displayed in one of these types of attachment relationships as you would in the other, even if sometimes the attachment styles might affect these relationships across kind. The same is true when we think about dogs. So dogs can have different relationships with different potential attachment figures. So dogs can form attachments to their primary caregivers. They can form bonds to children in the households. We might look at whether or not they form bonds to other animals in the households and whether these are similar or different to the bonds they form with people. They might form a different bond to their doggy daycare instructor or their handler. So there's lots of different kinds of relationships that dogs may experience as well. And so we don't want to automatically assume that all the relationships they're forming are the same kind. The other factor we have to consider is the quality. So we know, for example, from the many decades of research on human attachment, that even within the same category, so if we're thinking caregiver, offspring sort of attachment, that some individuals will form a secure attachment relationship with that parent or offspring or parent or caregiver figure, and others will form various types of insecure attachments. In all cases, the children might still be bonded to that caregiver, but the style of bonding and the style of effect that that relationship has on their behavior, their stress levels, and the quality of that relationship can differ from case to case. This is also true when we talk about dog-human relationships. And I think one fundamental thing that's really important is that when I first gave you the definition of attachment, it included proximity seeking. But that is not to say that proximity seeking is the only important factor in attachment, and we'll talk about why that's not the case today. So when we think about things like sociability, how much does the dog want to be around us and seek our proximity? That's one element of attachment, but how social the dog is does not tell us the quality of bond or the attachment style the dog has to the owner. There's lots of different reasons why a dog might seek our proximity. For example, a dog might be very anxious, and so it's hiding behind us all the time. Or a dog might be very confident and engaging with us in a more secure way. So we can't tell just from the amount of proximity seeking the quality of that relationship or the attachment style we're talking about. So we have to dig deeper when we're interested in the attachment bond. So how do we do that? How do we evaluate attachment? I'm going to show you the way that we most commonly do it in our lab, but again, keep in mind there are different ways and styles of evaluating attachment. And so if you're interested in this, I encourage you to keep learning about it, look in the literature, look at the resources available to find the style of assessment that might best suit the environment, the context, the type of attachment you're interested in. But in our lab, we're most often focused on this sort of relationship. So the caregiver-dependent relationship, oftentimes between adults and either children or adults and, in this case, dogs. And when we think about that relationship, we're really focusing on an individual that's providing the care, the food, the walking, the resources for a dependent. And dogs, even once they reach adulthood, are very dependent on their human caregivers to provide those sorts of needs in their life, and also for things like security. And as a result, we can evaluate attachment, even in adult dogs, in much the same way some of the early attachment studies were done between caregivers and offspring. So let's start with attachment quality. How we evaluate this, we tend to go back to that original methodology from the 1950s, and we use the secure-based test. And there's a number of reasons for this. One, because this test is a little bit more abbreviated. It allows us to test security of attachment across a wide range of species in a really effective, efficient manner. And it works really well in a variety of settings. So we can use this sort of test in the lab, but this is also a test that's really easy to use in an animal shelter and other applied settings. And basically what it looks like is you take an animal, in this case, we're going to be looking at a dog, and the dog's owner, so their primary caregiver and attachment figure. They enter a space that is novel to the dog. The human and the dog interact in a baseline phase for 2 minutes. Then we ask the owner, the caregiver, to leave the room. The dog is left alone in this unfamiliar space for 2 minutes. We can evaluate things like, does the dog search for the owner? Do they vocalize? Are they separating some level of separation distress? Then we have the owner return after 2 minutes, and we evaluate things like the reunion behavior and whether the dog is able to reduce stress, reduce sort of the effects of being left alone in that space, and go back to contact, exploration, balance. And this is very similar to the types of tests that are used with human infants and have been used since the 1950s to study attachment in a wide variety of species. So I'm going to show you some videos of the return phase. These are abbreviated videos, but what we're going to be looking for is what we see in the three most common attachment style classifications. So the first is secure attachment. Again, this is a novel space to this dog, and the owner has left this room after that baseline phase for 2 minutes. The dog was searching for the owner, and this is what happens when the owner returns. So you can see there's the reunion, there's the positive greeting, and now you're going to start seeing that contact, exploration, balance. So any distress that occurred from the owner's absence is now dissipating. Stress is reducing. The dog's going back to play, exploration, but still checking in with the owner. And that is what we expect to see in dogs that are securely attached. Now, this dog has experienced the same series of events, but this dog we would say has an insecure ambivalent attachment. And you'll see that the same reunion greeting behavior, the dogs look very similar at the start, but the main distinction with dogs with insecure ambivalent attachment to their caregiver is that they find it more difficult to reduce stress after the stressful event or after that brief absence. So you'll see that the signs of stress are sort of persisting. You're seeing sort of that tight tail wag. You're seeing the ears are pretty pinned. You're seeing a lot of physical contact. This is also really common in ambivalent attachments. And it's not that the dog is ambivalent about the owner's return. What's happening is the owner's return is having an ambivalent effect on the stress levels of the dog. And this is terminology taken from the original literature from the 1950s. So I didn't choose these terms, but you can see that the difference here is that the dog is still seeking that contact, still trying to use their owner as a source of security, but is less able to do so effectively. And then the last category is what we call insecure avoidant. We see less dogs in this category. It only represents usually around 5 to 10% depending on population, but we do see examples of this. These are dogs that also, in some cases, search for their owner upon their exit. In other cases, they don't. They self-soothe all the way through. But the really key distinction between these dogs and the ones that you just saw is that they tend not to engage in greeting behavior when the owner returns, or very muted greeting behavior. And they continue to show signs of stress, but they're more or less likely to self-soothe. They're not going to use their owner as their source of security for self-regulation. They do that independently. And so these same categories are seen not only in dogs, but also in human children. We've also seen them in cats. So again, these styles are present across species as well. But this is one way you can evaluate and see beyond whether or not these dogs have an attachment. All of these dogs have an attachment to their owner, but the kind of attachment that they have and how it affects how they handle stress in the proximity of their owner. So why do these attachment styles matter? Well, one of the nice things about having such a long history of attachment research in other fields, including the human psychological fields, is that we know that attachment style can predict a lot of important measures. So in human children, the attachment style with a caregiver early in life can predict things like the quality of future relationships, can also predict things like the risk of future depression, anxiety, impulsivity, their social competence, the level of risk-taking behavior, executive functioning, and motivation. And sort of across the board, individuals who have at least one secure attachment relationship with a caregiver fare better on most of these measures. They're going to have greater problem-solving persistence and executive function, greater motivation, greater social competence on average, and be less prone to some of these other things that are maybe less desirable, like suffering from depression or anxiety. Now, what's interesting is that now that we've been studying these sorts of things in dogs for a number of years, we're finding very similar things with dogs, that attachment styles, attachment relationships to human caregivers can also predict things like the quality of future relationships for that dog, what that dog might form, things like the risk of anxiety developing in the dog, neuroticism scores, social competence, problem-solving persistence, motivation. So again, we're finding that a lot of these predictors hold true in dogs as well, and that secure attachments often predict more beneficial outcomes in terms of the dog's motivation and welfare state, not only immediately, but also in the future. Here's one example. So in one study, we were interested in looking at dogs that had been diagnosed formally with separation anxiety. And then we had a comparison group, a control group of 20 dogs that had not previously been diagnosed with separation anxiety. We put them through the secure base test. And what we found is that dogs that had either secure attachment relationships to their caregivers or that had insecure avoidant attachments to their caregivers represented about the ratio of dogs that sort of reflect having separation anxiety in the greater US population. So about 40% of dogs, there have been some studies that suggest about 40% of dogs at some point in their life will be diagnosed with separation anxiety in the United States. And you can see that that rate is about the same for dogs in that secure and insecure group. But for dogs that had insecure ambivalent attachment relationships to their caregiver, and that's the one where they try to seek that proximity, they maintain that physical contact, but they have trouble reducing that stress and regulating that stress even when their owner is present. 90% of the dogs in that classification also had separation anxiety. So it's almost double the probability. And so this isn't causal data. We can't say one thing causes the other, but it is interesting that this attachment style correlates to this greater likelihood of separation anxiety diagnosis. And so I think it's important to understand these attachment styles and how they might correspond with these sorts of conditions. So let's also consider attachment kind briefly. So in addition to the quality or style of attachment, I talked about how dogs might have different kinds of relationships with different individuals in their life. And this really matters because if we think about different relationships in a dog's life as serving different functions, we should expect different behaviors with respect to those individuals. And I'll show you what I mean with data in just a second. But I think it's really important that we recognize that if we're looking for a secure relationship with the adult caregiver in the house, that bond and that relationship might not look exactly the same as a good relationship with another dog in the house or a good relationship with a child in the house. So we have to know what kind of relationship it is that we're evaluating. So again, just like humans have these different kinds of attachment relationships, dogs do as well. And one of the first places we started when we started asking these questions was to compare the relationship that we were seeing between dogs and their primary human caregiver and between two dogs in the household. So we were curious about whether the relationship or bond that two cohabitating dogs had, could it serve that same attachment security purpose for that dog as maybe being with a bonded human companion could. And I think this is an important question because sometimes people get additional pets, like additional dogs, to keep the other dog company or to keep the other dog feeling comfortable or secure when they're away at work or when they're away in other places. And there's not a lot of research to ask, is this true? Does this actually serve that function? So the way that we evaluated this is we used the very similar test as the one I showed you before, that secure base test. And we broke the dogs into two groups so we could have two different orders. One where we evaluated attachment style to the owner first. So we had the owner baseline, the alone phase, the owner reunion phase, followed by a dog baseline, so that same dog with a cohabitant dog in their household that they were bonded to, an alone phase, and then their cohabitant dog reunion phase. And then the other half of the dogs, we just tested in the opposite order to make sure that testing the owners first or the dogs first wasn't the thing that was having an effect on how the dogs were behaving. But every dog was tested in an attachment test with both their primary human caregiver and their cohabitant dog companion. So this is what the relationships look like. Just to give you again an example of a secure attachment relationship and an insecure attachment relationship with respect to a human caregiver. So you can see again on the secure attachment side, we have a dog that after the reunion is going back to play and exploration quite quickly. Whereas on the insecure attachment side, this dog would be classified as insecure ambivalent. They're still showing signs of stress and they're maintaining that proximity. You're not seeing that contact exploration balance as quickly as the dog with the secure attachment. Now we replicated this, as I said before, with dog-dog pairs, and that gets a little tricky when you're watching these videos, right? Because you're watching two dogs. So the arrow is going to start out on the focal dog. This is the dog who we're watching to determine an attachment style for. The dog that you'll see enter is the cohabitant dog. So that's the dog that we're trying to see whether or not they are serving any sort of secure base function. So what you're actually seeing here was pretty interesting. This is something that we saw in the great majority of dogs when the cohabitant dog returned. It's that the focal dog is almost acting as if their cohabitant dog has not returned. They're still engaging in separation distress, and they're still engaging in the search patterns that you would expect to see when the dog is left alone. So basically, they're searching for their human companion. And so what we found is that when we try to use the traditional attachment style classifications designed to measure attachment relationships between caregivers and dependents, we could not classify most dog-dog pairs using that attachment paradigm, that attachment mechanism. And we know that because we have two independent coders that are coding these videos, and then we look at inter-rater reliability, and we also look at can they come to mutual agreement in terms of classification style. And if they can't, a pair is considered unclassifiable. In dog-human pairs, 98% of dogs are classifiable into either secure or one of the insecure attachment categories, both sort of at that independent level where they're rating independently and when they come to mutual agreement. When we do this with dog-dog pairs, most dogs are unclassifiable. So that led us to ask this question: what other kind of bonds might better represent the relationship between two dogs in a household? Because typically one dog is not primarily caring for the other dog in the household, right? So functionally, that's not the relationship we would really expect. And we thought, you know, the other place in the literature where we see this sort of behavior, at least on the human side, is in the sibling attachment literature, where sometimes older siblings who are primarily responsible for the care of younger siblings will have caregiver-dependent style attachment relationships. The great majority of sibling relationships also do not fit well into this caregiver-dependent paradigm. And as a result, there have been whole new coding styles that have been developed to evaluate attachment relationships between two human siblings. So we asked, could we use one of those sibling attachment paradigms to better, more accurately classify dog-dog pairs, because functionally they're serving maybe a similar role. So what we did is we looked at those same videos where we were evaluating the dog-dog attachment relationships. We also reevaluated the human-dog attachment relationships using this paradigm. And this is what the ethogram looks like. It's called the SPPIR, which is basically the categories of the sibling attachment scale. So are the dogs soothed by the other dog's presence? Are they partially soothed? Do they engage in play? Do they ignore the dog? Or do they engage in resistant type of behavior, trying to get the other dog away from them? And what we found is that when we employ this sort of attachment paradigm to dogs, and we have independent coders coding using this ethogram, 98% of these dogs can be accurately classified. So it does seem that in terms of kind, the kind of relationship that we're seeing form between two dogs in a household seem more similar in terms of their behavior to what we'd expect from sibling relationships, and different from what we would expect from human caregiver dog relationships. Now, what's interesting is that even though dog-dog pairs fit well into this category, we do see still a lot of ignoring. So a lot of times the dog is still searching for that primary caregiver. That's unsurprising. Very similar things are seen in the human literature. Some dogs are partially soothed. A few are fully soothed. A few are resistant. But we are seeing a very different type of relationship. If we break this down into individual behaviors, we're also seeing other evidence of dogs not really playing a very soothing or secure-based role for their cohabitant dog partners. So one way we can look at this is we can look at the number of vocalizations we see and comparing what they do in the alone phase. So looking at that separation distress in the alone phase. And then we look to see what happens when their owner returns and what happens when the cohabitant dog returns. And when we look at comparisons in terms of vocalizations from alone phase to when the owner returns, we see a significant decrease in vocalizations. That is one indicator that the stress response that we would expect is decreasing upon the return of the human companion. However, we do not see that change when we look at what happens when the cohabitant dog returns. If we see a dog distressed and vocalizing when alone, they tend to continue doing that when that cohabitant dog returns as well, meaning that that dog is not serving a secure base function. So why is it important that familiar dogs are unlikely to be a secure base? What that means is that it is not necessarily going to help a dog that is anxious when being left alone to have another cohabitant dog present in the home in terms of reducing stress or providing that secure base function. The role that the humans are playing in that arena is fundamentally different than what a cohabitant dog is playing. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have multiple dogs. Dogs form bonds, they serve different functions, and they may produce other benefits, right? So there may be other reasons why it's beneficial to have more than one dog together, but this probably isn't it. And so I think it's important to remember that we shouldn't get another dog to try to functionally replace us if we think we're going to be out of the house a lot, because then we just have two dogs that are maybe not in the presence of that secure base. So just thinking about our role is still distinct and important in caring for our dogs, even if they have other dog companions in the household. Now we can ask the question, what about other relationships to people? So are all dog-human relationships the same? Between different caregivers in the household, between the dog and the child, is it the same as with the dog and the adult? What about the vet? And one of the things we know is that the same dog can have different attachment qualities or different attachment styles towards different people in the household. So even if the person is fulfilling the same similar function, they're both caregivers of that dog, the dog may have a secure attachment to one person and may have an insecure ambivalent or an insecure avoidant attachment to another person. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. But the other thing that might be true is that dogs may also form different kinds of relationships to people within the household or outside of the household. And so we really need to know what kind of attachment they're having as well. And so one place that this seemed really important to us is studying the dog-child bond. Because when we think about the role children play in the household, although many times families get dogs with the idea that this dog will be the child's dog and the child will be responsible for that dog, that only ends up being true in practice some of the time. So it is possible that some children do provide a lot of the caregiving for the dog, and we do in some cases see dogs having secure attachment relationships towards children that look like the caregiver-dependent relationship. However, we see that this is the case significantly less without any sort of intervention when compared to the kind of relationship that adult caregivers and dogs have in the household. So it's much more likely that an adult in the household is the secure attachment figure for a dog than a child in the household is, without any sort of training or intervention in place. However, one of the things that we do in our program is we try to do things that help build these bonds and improve these bonds. And especially we focus heavily on children with and without disabilities. And we're trying to not only improve the relationship, but improve welfare and health outcomes for both the dog and the child, including physical activity outcomes. But we find when we engage children in dog training programs that help them better interact with the dogs, better understand the dog's body language, and help them engage in positive reinforcement training, then we see a significant increase in dogs having secure attachment relationships towards those children. So we can shift these attachment relationships in a positive direction. This seems to be sometimes, in some cases, it's even easier to achieve in children than it is adults. And I'm not sure if that's because at this point, if that's because dogs haven't established a stable attachment relationship, or at least a stable caregiver type attachment relationship with the child at the time we start, and that's why it's easier to shift them to that secured style, or if it's because it's easier to help children modify their behavior towards the dog than it is to teach adults who have been doing things the same way for a long time to very actively change their behavior. But we do see these positive shifts when we engage children in these interventions. So sort of the takeaway here is that when we're looking at kids within a household, kids absolutely can be a secure base and they can be a caregiver role for a dog, but that this is not automatic. So it requires that the child is actually fulfilling some of those caregiving responsibilities and that they're behaving in ways that are fundamentally supportive of secure base attachment. Another area where we sometimes get asked about this is in foster environments or in shelter environments. And we have received support from Maddie's fund, which we're very grateful for, to study some of this in both dogs and cats and try to understand what these attachment relationships look like in places where the dog is living at the moment, but may not be its final forever home. And what we found is that dogs living in foster homes are more likely to show proportions of secure attachment relationship that match what we see for dogs that are considered pets in their forever homes. So we're seeing more secure relationships developing in foster environments compared to shelter environments. In some cases, dogs can form secure attachment relationships to caregivers in a shelter, but it's less common. And also the sort of the style of attachment and the kind seems to be more similar to what we see between pets and dogs in these foster environments. That may be one potential benefit for fostering dogs. So then how do we promote these secure attachments? So I'll go through this really quickly so we have some time for questions. But I think this is also important because we don't know with 100% certainty all aspects of the answer to this yet. This is something that we're still studying and trying to understand better and better. One aspect might be genetic. So there might be some genetic tendencies that make it easier or more challenging for dogs to form secure attachment relationships. So that's sort of still to be determined. We know that past experiences can influence the likelihood a dog will form a secure attachment relationship. So having a previous secure relationship with a person increases the ease with which that dog can form another secure attachment relationship in the future. But we also know that fundamentally, where that dog is right in this moment, the caretaker's behavior is a huge predictor of what type of attachment relationship that dog will have with that individual person. So what we find is that the best practices for encouraging secure attachment development between a dog and a person are to demonstrate the qualities of an authoritative parenting figure, which basically means that you have high responsiveness to the dog's needs. You pay attention to their body language. You can see when they're sick. You can see when they're scared. You can see when they are hungry and they're looking for treats, and that you're responsive to those needs and you meet the needs that they express needing. Also, though, this idea of having high expectations. So having rules, engaging in positive reinforcement training, and having consistent expectations that allows the dog to have some control and independence in their life so that they can do things and know that doing those things leads to positive outcomes, or doing certain things is not going to lead to a positive outcome. So being able to both have high expectations of your dog and also being highly responsive to their needs tends to promote secure attachment relationships. Some things that you might want to avoid if you're trying to develop a secure attachment relationship are things like isolation or lack of socialization. That seems pretty straightforward, but also anything that could be perceived by the dog as ignoring hunger, comfort, discomfort, proximity seeking, or sleep cues. So if you have a dog that really likes to be pet and it's coming and it's soliciting attention, then you don't want to just ignore the solicitations for attention, or at least not all the time. You want to try to reciprocate when you can. If you have a dog that doesn't especially like to be touched, then you don't want to force affection on that dog, right? It's about being responsive to the individual dog's cues and needs. And so that might look different for different dogs, but not being responsive to the individual needs of the dog can lead to insecure attachment formation, as can lack of consistent expectations. And so oftentimes we see dogs in this category ending up with insecure ambivalent attachments, which might mean the owner is very warm and loves their dog very much, but their dog still cannot receive security from the owner in the same way a securely attached dog can, because the owner is less predictable in their responsiveness to the dog's needs. The other thing to avoid is showing low responsiveness and high expectations. And this is what we typically associate with authoritarian parenting style. So this is where there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of, the owner has very strict expectations for what they want from the dog, but they're not especially sensitive to the cues and the needs that the dog might be projecting or giving off. Oftentimes too, we associate this category with things like aversive training methods. And we see that dogs in this category are most likely to develop insecure avoidant attachment relationships. And so when we think about this and we look at these best practices, and then we actually look at them in practice in terms of the proportion of secure and insecure attachment relationships we see, it's pretty clear that that high responsiveness, high expectation category is where we see the greatest proportion of secure attachment relationships. So if you're trying to foster that kind of relationship, those ideally are the kinds of behaviors that you're shooting for in that relationship with the dog. The other thing to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned before, one secure attachment relationship often predicts those beneficial outcomes we talked about before, both in children and in dogs. So it's not that every relationship in that dog's life has to be a secure one. If it is, that's wonderful. But even if you can have influence over being that one secure base for a dog, then that dog is more likely to have an easier time forming those future secure relationships, having lower anxiety, having lower depression, having lower risk of some of those other behavior problems that we talked about, and being more persistent, more able to calm themselves, more able to problem solve. So one is always better than none. The other thing we should keep in mind is this does not mean we should treat dogs like human children, right? So again, attachment is true. It's a concept that is across species. So I'm not saying because human children have attachment to us, and it looks similar to the way that dogs attach to us, therefore we should treat dogs like children. That's not what I'm saying. Again, it's about being responsive to those individual and species specific needs. So if we're going to have high levels of responsiveness, that means understanding and being aware of the needs that dogs have, and more specifically, our individual dog has, and being responsive to those needs in a species and individual appropriate way. And then the other thing to keep in mind is new relationships are a great opportunity to form strong, secure attachment bonds. Dogs start bonding very quickly, and those bonds can solidify into one of those attachment styles pretty quickly. And while we can see shifts in attachment style over time with a lot of work and effort, if you go in intentionally with the idea that you're going to be highly responsive and you're going to have high consistent expectations, that increases the odds of developing that secure attachment right from the start. We set you off on sort of the best possible foot. And then finally, I want to say, for those of you who are engaged in fostering or maybe are working in a shelter and have opportunities to bond with dogs that won't necessarily live with you forever, don't be afraid to bond, because all the research suggests that forming those bonds, even if they're temporary, a secure attachment bond makes the likelihood of developing future secure attachment bonds higher. So if you form that secure bond with the dog, don't think that now when it is separated from you, it's going to be harmed in some way. It might miss you, it might experience some separation distress, but the research suggests that actually you're doing a lot of good in that dog's life as it moves forward and has the ability to form those forever bonds. So don't be afraid to bond, even if it's a temporary relationship. So again, what can we do? Socialization, social play, positive reinforcement training, offer attention if that's something that the dog is soliciting or is receptive to, being responsive to an individual's dog's needs, providing support, and then also providing those consistent expectations. And then finally, keep learning about dogs, keep learning about attachment and the relationships we share with them. And you are all off to a great start by attending these lectures. So I hope this provided you with some additional tips and information that you can put to use. And again, I thank you all for being here. I also have a whole team that I need to thank and many sponsors I need to thank for making this work possible. Of course, the dogs and the owners that make this possible as well. I'm going to leave you with a couple of reference slides. And if there's any time left, I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. Thank you all.
That was fascinating. We have some really good questions in the question box. One is, with the pandemic and many people adopting pets and staying home, did this increase the rate of separation anxiety for pets because they didn't leave the pets alone and get them used to that state?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And I know that there are many researchers who have been asking that same question. And the results have sort of been mixed, right? So the way that oftentimes these studies work is it can take a little bit of time, sometimes even a couple of years, for us to really have enough studies to get the full picture of what happened at a period of time. And so I know initially there were some reports suggesting that the pandemic may have led to some ill effects in certain dogs. There have been other studies that have suggested the opposite. I know our lab right now is looking specifically at how the pandemic and time spent at home, how those changes affected attachment relationships and attachment quality. But I know we're still analyzing that data, and I'm sure other labs are still analyzing a lot of their data as well. So I absolutely think, just like the pandemic affected us in a number of ways as humans, the pandemic more than likely had impacts on animals and animal behavior. I think a lot of us have seen changes in individual behavior in animals maybe within our own home, but I don't think we can at this point answer sort of definitively for all animals. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see a lot of research coming out on just what was going on with the animals during the pandemic.
How do you identify when a dog was bonded to the other dog they cohabitated with?
So one of the things we analyzed the sort of bond formation in very similar ways, although you can see we changed the ethogram. So we're looking at the dynamics of the dog in the households. We're also looking at the dynamics of the dog in these various tests. And one of the things that we're seeing is how the dogs respond not only when they're in the proximity of each other, but also how they respond when they're in the absence of each other. It can be in some cases that, some of these dogs may not have had especially good bonds, and especially when we're looking at the classification of the SPPIR, when you're seeing that resistance from the other dog, then that might indicate that there's something going on there where those dogs haven't fully formed a relationship. But in most of these cases, you can see other indicators of bond formation. Like you still see the proximity seeking, you still see the preferential interaction, but that doesn't necessarily always translate to security of attachment. And the same is going to be true with people, that you can see indicators of bond formation, but that doesn't necessarily predict whether it's going to be a secure or an insecure bond. So very similar approach to evaluating attachment as sort of like whether or not it exists. And then there's those additional steps where you have to evaluate then attachment quality separately.
One of the big questions in animal shelters is when we're trying to identify whether a pair of dogs or a pair of cats are a bonded pair, and that it's important for us to adopt them out together. Is any of the work that you've done lean towards maybe having could we use this dog-dog attachment test to assess bonding or no?
Yeah, you absolutely could use it to assess bonding, but then the question really becomes, what is the function of rehoming those two animals together, right? And it could be that, they're providing other forms of benefit to each other, and we really haven't gotten to that point yet. So what we know is that the animals are unlikely, and we have done this with cats too, we're still working on some of that data. The animals are unlikely serving that secure base function in many of these cases to the other animal unless it is a biological mother and that individual's offspring. There's one study that suggests sometimes that carries over. But outside of that, if they're two bonded individuals, we're probably not looking at a secure base effect situation in most cases. So then the question is, what benefits do these bonded individuals provide to each other beyond the secure base effect? And I don't think we have a lot of good literature on that. And so there may be really good reasons to rehome those animals together that fall outside of this one measure. So I think you could absolutely evaluate bonding with this test, but I don't think it would give you a definitive answer on whether or not you should rehome those animals together, because even if the cohabitant animal is not fulfilling a secure base function, it could be doing something else that's meaningful. So I think we need to understand sort of what benefits then these other kinds of relationships have and evaluate that when rehoming. Just like we wouldn't say that, a sibling relationship was unimportant just because that sibling wasn't providing the same function as a parent, right? They still have an important relationship. So we need to understand what those relationships do in the lives of those animals as well.
How is attachment influenced by the critical socialization period?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the critical period of socialization, when you're actually socializing the animal to a particular species or kind of potential companion, that's really where attachment, or the base attachment, is formed. So that has to fundamentally occur to have the attachment bond, which then later can develop into these kinds of attachment. So I would say if you're thinking about attachment as one sort of compartment that you're analyzing, and you're thinking about attachment quality or kind as like another sort of bucket, early socialization imprinting is the establishment of the attachment bond. So it's critical to it. But again, once that bond is established with a particular species or kind, then that individual can still form other attachment relationships with other individuals of that species or kind. And those relationships and styles can vary. So certainly that first attachment relationship, if it's a secure one, that's great, because again, that's going to affect every subsequent attachment relationship that's formed potentially. But just because, as long as the animal forms an attachment and is socialized, even if that attachment is insecure, there's still a possibility of forming secure attachments with others later in life.
You said that cohabitating dogs tends to more closely resemble the human sibling ethograms than the parent-child ethograms. Is this flipped with littermate syndrome in dogs?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And we don't know for sure. There has been one study, not by our lab, but in another lab that looked specifically at attachment between related individuals. And that was the study that looked both between sort of sibling relationships and mother offspring relationships. And I don't know how it ties in necessarily to the litter mate syndrome, because no one's ever studied, to my knowledge, specifically attachment relationships with populations that have shown behaviors that are considered associated with that. But what does seem to be true is that very similar things are found in terms of not having that same caregiver dependent type of attachment relationship outside of biological mother and offspring. So again, I don't know that it necessarily flips itself on its head, right? I think, when you're looking at the sibling relationships or you're classifying it into those categories, it gives you an idea of how they respond to that other partner in a stressful situation. And in some cases, an animal might be soothed by that, in some cases not. And you could certainly evaluate siblings, like biological siblings of animals that way as well. But to my knowledge, it hasn't been done. So I don't have any sort of definitive answer for you on that.
Thank you. How did you operationally define separation anxiety for the experiment?
Yeah, so for that particular experiment, we did have a definition that was essentially the diagnostic criteria for separation anxiety commonly used in prior publications. But we also were looking specifically at dogs that had been clinically diagnosed by a vet with separation anxiety. So that we recruited 20 dogs that had the diagnosis and 20 dogs that had not been diagnosed. So in addition to collecting behavioral information. And so I think in that case, we were really interested in the probability of the attachment style corresponding to a veterinarian's diagnosis. But there are different ways you could do it.
And then the last question is, they're wondering about dogs being stressed just being in a strange place, and if the results might be different in our own home.
Yes, so it's very difficult to evaluate attachment this way in a home for that exact reason. So in this particular methodology, both in the secure base test and in the Ainsworth strain situation test, and it's kind of in the title, right? Strain situation. The idea is that you're putting animals or kids into a situation that's a little bit strange. It's not super distressing, but it's kind of stressful. And you're wanting to see how they respond to a potential attachment figure when they are stressed, because what you're looking for is, can they use that other individual to reduce their stress and return to sort of a baseline state? If you do this in the home and the animal is comfortable in the home and it doesn't get that stressed when you leave, then you're not going to be able to evaluate how effective you are at providing that attachment security to the animal. So there have been versions of this that are done at home, and usually in some cases there's other strange things that happen to try to elevate stress, but it's much easier to get consistent responses using this methodology in a strange location. But there may be other tests. There are, like I said, a variety of assessments. There may be other tests that are more compatible for home environments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Udell. This webcast was incredible, and I'm also just very grateful for all the research that you're doing that is working to improve the relationships that we have with our animal friends. So thank you. And thanks also to our audience for joining us today. You can continue the discussion or ask more questions on Maddie's Pet Forum. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.